Welcome to r/MaliciousCompliance, where we share stories of people conforming to the letter, but not the spirit of a request. Thank you, friends, for subscribing to the channel and for so many likes. The first story. If you want to force your employer to abide by a contract, make sure you understand the contract. The second story. Company collapsed after stupid rules that prevented us technologists from working normally. The third story. Boss ordered my father to cut his hair or leave. My father chose both options. Today's first story is union overtime. I worked in a factory on afternoon shift, 3 p.m. to 11 p.m. In another department were two lazy guys. Their department was pretty much fully staffed, and their job was basically to clean the department, make sure raw materials were available for the next day, that sort of thing. On Fridays, the day shift were often asked to work overtime on Saturdays, starting with the most senior employees and working down the list. These two guys were never asked, usually because by the time they arrived for their Friday evening shift, there were enough day shift volunteers to cover what was needed. They discovered that some of the day shift volunteers had less seniority than they did, so they kept their mouths shut, and for months they recorded each Saturday that a less senior employee worked. Then they filed a grievance, stating that they missed out on the overtime because they weren't asked, and should be compensated for all those Saturdays. The company said okay, then cited a clause in the contract that said they were liable for only 30 calendar days, as it was the employee's responsibility to bring any wage errors to the company in a timely manner. In that past month, there was one Saturday that a less senior employee worked a Saturday, so they paid each of these guys a day's worth of OT. Then the company transferred these guys back to day shift. They objected to the transfer and lost, as it was ironclad in the contract that the company has the right to assign employees where they were needed. Both had preschool kids, and both had wives that worked days. Dad would watch the kids while mom was at work. Then a babysitter or family member would come in and watch them for a couple of hours, between when dad left for work and mom returned home. Not anymore. They had to arrange daycare for the full day at considerable expense. Mom had to leave early to drop off the kids, and dad had to pick them up on the way home. But they did manage to profit that single day's worth of overtime. The second story is don't deviate from the flowchart. Okay, if you insist. About a decade ago, I had the misfortune of working in a call center for a company, which provided phone, broadband, and satellite TV channels. This was the days before fiber, so the setup was slightly different from what you see these days. To begin with, I worked in customer services doing things like booking pay-per-views, changing billing dates, and upgrading packages. After a year or so, the powers that be decided the whole call center would be trained on phone and broadband tech support, and we would take those calls instead. Lots of people complained because they weren't technically minded, and found the idea of fixing tech issues daunting. I was not worried because I'm a massive nerd, and was building my own computers from age 12. My dad started teaching me when I was about 8. This new type of call sounded much more interesting, and I was looking forward to it. The staff were told, "Don't worry, we will train you. It's simple, really." To be fair to them, they were right. Kind of. For those who don't know, the original internet connection, dial-up, was an issue because the phone line was totally used up by the internet connection, meaning you couldn't make calls at the same time as using your glacier-like connection. Broadband revolutionized this system because it allowed both phone and internet to be used at the same time, and it improved the connection speed to allow for more data to be transferred. Think of dial-up as a country road, slow speeds and only one kind of traffic at a time, or you end up with a massive queue of cars, lorries, and tractors clogging the road with no filtering spaces for motorbikes. Broadband is the equivalent of a dual carriageway. 2 lanes of traffic in each direction means you can get more traffic into your city at higher speeds. The issue with more traffic is that you need to add more road signs to direct it to the correct destination. Phone signals to the phone, broadband signals to the router. To do this, you needed to have a micro filter, as the first thing plugged into every single phone port in use in the house. The TV installation, which happened first, did not include a microfilter, and customers would assume the TV installation wouldn't need to be messed with, so they didn't add one when they set up their router. The number one complaint on the tech support line was caused by that filter being missing. It resulted in slow or intermittent broadband connections, and static on phone lines and dropped calls. People would phone up and scream at me because the connection was fine to start with, but the phone line has always been bad, and now the connection keeps dropping. As I mentioned, most of the staff were upset at being moved from a customer service role to a tech role, so the higher-ups had a troubleshooting system created. It was basically a glorified flowchart with a pretty interface. The issue is that whoever created it didn't think it through. No matter where the problem was with the tech issue, the chances were that the customer would need to be calling on a mobile phone, so that the right steps could be followed. Most customers did not call on mobiles because in those days, calls from mobile phones were expensive. Even calls to landlines, and especially calls to 0845 numbers, like call centers. This information was missing from the flowchart, and it meant that if the customer tried to change the way their equipment was connected, or if we ran a line test, it would result in the call dropping because they were disconnecting their landline handset, or we were stopping all signals down the line for a couple of minutes to do the test. It was assumed that we would call our customers back if this happened, because it was impressed into us that the point was to resolve the tech issue. If the customer has to keep calling back and speaking to different people, then it slowed this process down. The flowchart did not say call your customer back. The thing with me being kind of techie was that I could usually identify the fault in the first minute of the call based on the symptoms described by the customer, and I seem to have a knack for being able to explain tech issues using accessible language, so the customer understands what is happening without feeling condescended to. This meant that my calls were shorter, more efficient, and my customer satisfaction survey results, CSATs, were high. What's not to like? Well, you know how I mentioned that the powers that be decided to take non-techie people and put them in a tech role? It went about as well as you would expect. The flowchart worked to a point, but people who had no tech knowledge tried to cut corners and it resulted in problems. Free replacement routers were issued for external line fault problems, which is like replacing the roundabout on an interchange when the problem is a tree on the road 10 miles from there. Engineers were sent to resolve external faults caused by dead master phone sockets, about as useful as doping roadworks the next town over in an attempt to get more traffic through a flooded slip road at your town's boundary. Repeat calls were up, resolutions were down, customer satisfaction was low for the call center as a whole. There were about 20 of us who were doing well, because of course, I wasn't the only nerd in the call center. We used our common sense and tech know-how to get results, and my team of about 15 was around 50% tech nerd. Our manager loved it because we had the best results of the whole call center, and she looked amazing, despite being a Luddite herself. Head office kept trying to get the rest of the call center up to our level. They couldn't figure out why people hired to be glorified phone concierges couldn't fix phone lines. Obviously, the problem must be the staff. Sarcasm. Word was issued from on high. Thou shalt not deviate from the flowchart. I foolishly thought that they only meant the people with CSATs, which were through the floor. I thought the people who knew what we were talking about would be left to it. Slowly but surely, the rest of the call center's scores started climbing out of the toilet. Our team was still constantly the highest, but the gap wasn't so embarrassingly massive anymore. Others were resisting using the flowchart. People at the peak of Mount Stupid on the Dunning-Kruger graph fought the idea that they didn't know enough to act without the dubious support of the admittedly quite bad flowchart. Upper management started thinking of ways to make them use it. A new score was added to our stats, adherence to process. Quality control started failing our work if we deviated from the flowchart. My manager started writing me and the others up for it. We tried to explain that the flowchart worked for the people who didn't know computers actually worked, because it methodically went through every possibility over the course of about an hour and a half. If you don't know where the fault is, then eventually you will stumble over the right fix. But when you have some knowledge and can tell within the first 5 seconds that Mr. Smith has accidentally turned off his wireless card, surely it's better customer service to jump right to that? Apparently not. She said that if we deviated from the flowchart again, she would start the disciplinary process, which always and without exception resulted in the person being fired sooner or later. Okay then, no more using our brains. All of us stopped using our prior knowledge to fix the faults quickly. I stopped explaining the issue to the clients. We literally just read the flowchart instructions in all their mind-numbing and typoed glory. I also stopped calling customers back when the line dropped due to flaws in the flowchart. Every time this happened, I would leave a note on the client's profile. Line dropped when doing X test. I have been told never to deviate from the flowchart, or I'll be taken to disciplinary action. There is no instruction to say I can call my customer back, so I didn't. If customer calls back in, test result was Y. One of my colleagues delighted in telling his customers, yes, I know exactly what the problem is, and it will only take 5 minutes to fix, but first I'm required to do these other tests. It will take about 40 minutes to get to the point where I'm allowed to fix your issue. Why? Well, manager has threatened me with unemployment if I use my brain, so I have to go down the list here, and it'll take 40 minutes to get to the one that I know will resolve your problem. Suddenly our team was at the bottom of the CSAT board. Our repeat calls were through the roof. We were the worst performing team in the call center. Our manager was being questioned by upper management about why our scores had plummeted. The head office was going to take us off tech and put us onto debt management lines if we didn't start getting our score back up to where it was. Obviously, that didn't happen. Most of the techie people left the business. I stuck it out long enough to see the tech role removed and the debt lines instated. Just before I started my new job with my current employer, head office sent out their annual feedback survey. I ripped them a new one in brutal feedback, from the micromanaging to inappropriate staff roles for the people hired, to predatory upselling to vulnerable customers, and unethical debt management practices. I heard that some of the managers were fired, so it seems other people spoke out too, and there were some top-down changes which fixed some of the superficial issues. Oh, and the terrible flowchart? They prettied it up, added the fiber options, and put it on their website, so that people with mobile data can fix their own broadband issues. At least they got rid of the typos first. Edit. My manager tried to pull me up on it once. She even got to the recorded meeting with a minute taker and everything. Her. You said X on the phone to a customer. Me. Yes. Her. What made you think that was appropriate or professional? Me. You told me you would start disciplinary proceedings if I didn't follow flowchart name. The flowchart says X, so I say X. If you want me to stop following the flowchart when I know better, then I will need that in writing. Her. Anger. The last story is, don't come back until you get a haircut. This isn't my story, it's my dad's. In the late 60s and early 70s, my dad worked at a car repair shop. It was his first job, so he didn't really know what to expect. He loved cars and still does. He has so many vintage car restoration projects in our garage, and every couple of months he goes race car driving around various tracks. So when he got this job, he was ecstatic. His dad, my grandpa, taught him about cars and such, and he wanted to learn more, so this job meant a lot to him. He had a boss, let's call him Billy, who my dad describes as a rich redneck, had the money, did not dress the part. Now, my dad was a hippie. Think a mix of Hyde and Kelso from that 70s show. He had long brown shaggy hair, a 70s porn stash, wore bell-bottom corduroy pants and paisley blouses. Well, Billy only had one problem with my dad. No, not all the psychedelics he was on. Not that Billy thought my dad was bad with cars. It was his long, luscious locks. See, Billy was a balding, short guy while my dad was the opposite. So Billy decided my dad needed to cut his hair due to it being unprofessional. Just to remind you, my dad's a car mechanic in the 70s. Billy told my dad several times to get a haircut, and my dad always refused, until one day Billy had enough and said, "Don't come back until you have a haircut." So my dad packed up and took his tools home. He waited 2 weeks and finally got a haircut, then showed up to work. Billy was absolutely outraged when he saw him. He came storming over to him. This isn't exactly what was said, as it's been about 50 years, but you'll still get the gist of it. Billy, where the hell have you been? You think you still have a job here? My dad, I didn't come back to work here. I'm here for my last paycheck. Billy, what took you so long? Why didn't you just tell me you were leaving permanently? My dad, well, you said I couldn't come back in unless I got a haircut. And I wanted my paycheck, but I really didn't want a haircut. So I procrastinated. At that point, Billy just went to his office and grabbed my dad's check and handed it to him aggressively, while saying through gritted teeth, "Don't you dare come back here." And my dad responded gladly as he walked out of the auto shop. Edit. He said not to come back without a haircut, but my dad wanted his last paycheck, and he'd have to come in for that. My dad was joining the Seabees soon, so he figured he might as well cut his hair a little sooner than later to peeve off his dad. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel. See you in the next video.